At the very start, those 4 words, "the translator's not coming," nearly sank a $300 million deal in less than 5 minutes. Inside a bright Miami mansion, Jonathan Miller, a hard-nosed billionaire tech executive, felt his empire wobble while a group of powerful Middle Eastern investors sat in silence, their faces unreadable. Every detail had been polished, every slide translated into 2 languages, but the most essential piece was missing. The translator had bailed at the last minute. The air practically hummed with tension as phones buzzed and assistants scrambled, panic spreading like wildfire. Just when it looked like the meeting, and Jonathan's reputation, was about to collapse, a voice spoke from the back. It wasn't from one of the suits at the table. It came from Grace Johnson, the housekeeper no one paid attention to. Clutching a rag in one hand, she said calmly, "I speak Arabic. I can help." What followed didn't just keep the deal alive. It upended assumptions, flipped the power dynamic, and showed that the most overlooked person in the room had all the leverage. At first, the words just hung there. Grace, the woman who scrubbed floors and polished glass, the one who rarely got more than a nod, had just volunteered to rescue the most important meeting of the year. Jonathan turned toward her, blinking like he'd seen a ghost. "You know Arabic?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. Grace nodded, rag still in hand. "Yes, sir. Both classical and Gulf dialects. I studied linguistics before I ended up here." The room went quiet for a beat. Then Ally, the Ivy League assistant with a sharp tongue, let out a snort. Cameron, the junior associate, smirked like the whole thing was a joke. But across the table, one of the older investors, Mr. Al-Hassan, spoke in Arabic, his tone cautious but curious. Without a pause, Grace replied fluently. Her words flowed smooth and exact. The investors leaned in, eyebrows raised, and soon suspicion gave way to smiles. The mood in the room began to shift. Jonathan didn't catch the details, but he could see what mattered. The tide had turned, and Grace was steering it. He motioned to an open chair by the investors. "Sit," he told her. "Make it count." With quiet confidence, Grace walked over, still holding the rag like a reminder of where she came from and what she refused to be defined by. As she began translating the opening remarks, her voice cut through the tension like a cool breeze on a hot day. She didn't just echo words. She conveyed tone, respect, and meaning. Every stumble in Jonathan's pitch, every cultural slip buried in the sleek slides, she adjusted on the fly. Her delivery was precise, elegant, and never showy. The investors, once distant, started leaning in. One even offered her a bottle of water, a small but telling sign of respect. Grace politely declined, staying locked in on the work. Jonathan couldn't believe it. This woman, someone whose name he'd barely known, wasn't just saving the meeting. She was leading it. And as he looked around, he realized something he'd never let himself see before: the walls that kept her invisible weren't real. They were built out of habit, assumption, and hierarchy. And Grace had just stepped right through them. By the end of the hour, the atmosphere had completely changed. The investors were engaged, asking questions, even showing excitement. Jonathan, who had been moments away from disaster, was back in control, all because of the one person he'd ignored. During a short break, he leaned toward her and asked quietly, "Where did you learn to do this?" Grace met his eyes for the first time, steady and unflinching. "In rooms like this," she said. "Rooms where nobody expects anything from me. That's where I learned to watch, to listen, and to be ready." Jonathan had no answer. For the first time in years, the man who always had a comeback was speechless. The pause was short, just enough for water refills, glances exchanged, and hushed investor whispers. Jonathan tried to look calm, but he couldn't deny the truth. He'd nearly lost the biggest deal of his life, and Grace was the only reason it was still alive. When the group reconvened, she stayed focused. The rag was now folded neatly beside her notebook, but she hadn't forgotten it. To her, it wasn't just a cleaning cloth. It was a shield, a reminder of who she was and the strength she carried. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet. About 15 minutes into the next phase of talks, one of the investors, Mr. Al-Hassan, slid a printed draft of the partnership agreement across the table to Grace. It was supposed to be routine, just a quick comparison to the slides they'd already seen. But as her eyes moved across the Arabic text, her expression tightened. Buried in the fine print, between harmless-sounding jargon, was a clause that wasn't harmless at all. Her finger hovered over it. The Arabic wording had been shifted ever so slightly, just enough to tilt the balance of power. If ignored, it would give Miller Technologies complete control over any overseas patents, a direct violation of what had been promised. Whether it was a costly mistake or intentional sabotage didn't matter. Grace lifted her head, calm and steady. In Arabic, she told Mr. Al-Hassan, "There's a serious problem with this clause." Jonathan leaned forward, clearly confused. What kind of problem? Switching into English, Grace explained, "This version grants your company full ownership of any technology developed in the Middle East, no matter who contributes." That was never agreed upon. The room froze. Investors exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Jonathan's face drained of color. "You're certain?" Grace nodded firmly. "Completely. But if you let me fix it right now, we can avoid disaster." Jonathan gave her a sharp nod. With exact clarity, Grace laid out the issue to the investors, speaking their language, using their terms, giving context that mattered to them. She didn't shift blame, didn't soften the truth. She just showed them the problem and the solution. When she finished, Mr. Al-Hassan smiled faintly. "You didn't just translate the words," he told her. "You translated the intent." Another investor added, "You gave us back our trust." Jonathan leaned back, taking it in. But this time, the spotlight wasn't on him. It was on Grace. And it wasn't luck, it was skill. By the end, a corrected draft was printed, free of errors. Grace translated the final message from the investors. "They say they now see you as trustworthy," she told Jonathan, "thanks to Miss Grace Johnson." Jonathan nodded quietly, still in disbelief. Downstairs in the copy room, Ally, the assistant who had once sneered, refreshed her inbox. A new subject line appeared, "Internal Review. Report to HR." Her attempt to sabotage Grace had failed, and worse, she didn't even need to be exposed. The truth had done that for her. Upstairs, Grace gathered her things. On the table sat the rag she always carried, right next to the contract she had just saved. She glanced at it, then at the marble walls that had once made her feel small. Not anymore. In that moment, Grace Johnson wasn't the maid who shocked everyone. She was the woman no one would ever underestimate again. The next morning, Grace arrived at the Miller estate earlier than usual. Not out of duty, but instinct. Something had changed. It wasn't the polished stone or the smell of espresso, it was the way people looked at her as she passed. Eyes lingered longer, voices dropped to whispers before rising into awkward greetings. She wasn't invisible anymore. At the top of the stairs stood Ally, arms crossed, her voice sugary sweet. "Good morning, Grace," she said, trying too hard. Grace offered a calm nod. "Morning, Ally. No venom, just peace. The kind that unsettles people who cling to hierarchy." Later that day, Jonathan called Grace into his office, the same place she once entered only to dust shelves and polish brass. This time, she walked in without hesitation. Jonathan looked different, tie loose, sleeves rolled, his usual hard edge softened into something closer to humility. "I spoke with the investors," he said. "Impressed isn't the word. They were moved. They want you at every future meeting, officially." Grace raised an eyebrow. "As what? A translator?" He shook his head. "As our international liaison." You'd handle cross-cultural talks, negotiations, strategy. You'd report directly to me. Grace studied him carefully. And your team? Will they accept that? A maid in the boardroom? He leaned forward. They'll have to. Or they can leave. She gave the faintest smile. And you? Do you trust me, or are you just protecting your deal? He let the silence stretch before answering. Maybe both, he admitted. But yesterday, I saw something in you I can't ignore. Grace stood tall, shoulders squared. Then I'll do it. But on one condition. Name it, Jonathan said. No more uniforms, Grace replied. And I don't come in through the back door anymore. Jonathan let out a long breath before nodding. Deal. That simple agreement rewrote years of quiet injustice. For the first time, Grace's place in those halls of power wasn't just tolerated, it was wanted, and respected. The following week at company headquarters, her new badge read, Grace Johnson, International Liaison. Nobody called her, the help, anymore. People addressed her as Miss Johnson, ma'am, or sometimes not at all, because authority has a way of leaving people speechless. But Grace wasn't chasing applause. She was building something much bigger than ego. She was building a standard. And every step she took past glass walls and leather chairs was proof, she'd earned her place. Not through favors, but through value. At 3:04 p.m., Jonathan's voice came through her intercom. Grace, can you step in for a minute? She walked into his office. This time, he didn't bother with the formal act. The investors are launching a new R&D hub in the Gulf, he said. They want you on site. 3 months. You'd be the strategist, the overseer, the face of the partnership. Grace didn't answer right away. She studied him. Not virtual, he added. They want you there. In person. Her voice was steady. Why? Because it makes business sense. Or because you finally see me? Jonathan met her eyes. Both. Grace gave a small nod. If I go, my sister comes with me. She's stable now, but I won't leave her behind. Of course, he said without hesitation. Whatever you need. She turned toward the window, watching the skyline glow gold under the sunset. All my life, she said quietly, people told me what I couldn't do. And now, for the first time, someone asked, why not? Jonathan stepped closer. You've always been more than the role they forced on you. Grace didn't respond. She didn't have to. Because in that office, the same one she used to clean in silence, she had redrawn the lines of leadership. And this time, the lines carried her name. 2 years later, the company sign no longer read Miller Technologies. It read Miller and Johnson International. From the street, it looked like a sleek empire of glass and steel. But inside, it pulsed with something rarer, fairness, empathy, change. At the heart of it stood Grace Johnson. Her name wasn't on cleaning schedules anymore. It appeared on global contracts, conference banners, and government reports. But she didn't care about titles. What mattered were the doors she had opened, and the people now walking through them. That morning, Grace wasn't on a stage. She was on the grounds of the old Miller estate, now transformed into something far greater, the Johnson Institute for Leadership and Voice. It was a foundation for young black girls, immigrant teens, and quiet dreamers who the world too often ignored. In the garden, a small group of girls listened to a mentor. Grace stood beneath an oak tree, the same terrace where she once stood invisible, mop in hand. Only now, she stood tall, head high, the marble beneath her feet finally hers. Jonathan appeared beside her. Do you remember the first time I really saw you? He asked. Grace smiled. I was holding a rag. But it felt like I was carrying something bigger. You were, he nodded. And you still are. They walked in silence for a moment, the sound of young laughter carrying across the courtyard. Jonathan paused. Sometimes I think, if that translator hadn't cancelled, you'd have stumbled through the meeting, Grace finished, and I'd still be wiping glass nobody looks through. He let out a half laugh, half sigh. And none of this would exist. Grace turned to him, her voice calm but certain. Do you know why it worked, Jonathan? Why? Because when someone like me walks into a room they were never invited to, and stays, the world has no choice but to reshape itself around that truth. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. A breeze caught a few strands of her hair, brushing them gently across her shoulders. From across the garden, a young girl rushed over, notebook clutched to her chest. Miss Grace, she said, breathless, I have an idea. Would you be the first to read it? Grace knelt down, meeting her at eye level. Of course, sweetheart. Show me everything. The world needs your voice. Because Grace Johnson wasn't just translating words anymore. She was translating futures. And where others had built walls, she was leaving doors wide open. That night in Houston, the skyline shimmered like stars trapped in glass. From the balcony of a high-rise suite, Grace stood quietly, the warm southern wind tugging at the ends of her scarf. Inside, her sister slept peacefully, safe, stable, finally free from years of uncertainty. For the first time in her life, Grace wasn't surviving. She was living. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan lit the screen. How are you? Really? Grace stared at it for a moment, then typed back, at peace. You. Grace had typed, and the reply came instantly, trying to figure out who I was before I met you, and why I let that version of me last so long. What followed wasn't just a stream of messages. It became a conversation stretched across days, sometimes playful, sometimes brutally honest. Their late-night exchanges blurred the line between business partners and something deeper. Not romance, but recognition. One night, Jonathan called. Hey, I know it's late, but when you get back, I want to take you somewhere. Where? Grace asked. Not some overpriced steakhouse with water that costs $10, he said with a laugh. The neighborhood I grew up in. It's not pretty, but it's real. Then maybe I'll say yes. There was a pause. His voice dropped lower. You didn't just change the company, Grace. You changed something in me. And that scares the hell out of me. She exhaled slowly. Fear is the price we pay for transformation, Jonathan. But you've already learned how to carry it. He stayed quiet for a beat. Then he admitted, you make me want to be better. Not for praise. Not out of guilt. Just because I finally want to. Grace didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. His words weren't about earning approval. They were about finally setting down the armor. A few days later, the investors invited Grace to a private gathering. The eldest among them handed her a small pendant, a gold circle with a single Arabic word engraved, hikmah. Wisdom. You didn't just translate our language, he told her. You translated our hearts to them, and theirs to us. That is worth more than any contract. Grace held the pendant gently. In that moment, she understood. She wasn't just a bridge anymore. She was shaping something entirely new. 2 years passed. Miller & Johnson International had become a global powerhouse. But Grace never chased the spotlight. She used it, redirected it, and aimed it at voices still waiting to be heard. Back at the Johnson Institute, Grace stood in the courtyard, watching a group of young girls dream out loud. One of them spun around, beaming, notebook in hand. Miss Grace, I wrote something. Will you read it first? Grace knelt down, eyes glowing. Always. Show me everything. The world needs your voice. Because Grace Johnson didn't step into power like she belonged. She stepped in like she built the ground beneath her own feet. And for every locked room, every whispered doubt, every back door she'd once been told to use, she left it open for the next girl to walk through. Head high. Not as a guest, but as the revolution. Sometimes all it takes is a single moment, one choice to speak, one step forward, one refusal to stay silent, and the world begins to shift. Grace Johnson never set out to change a company, or a culture. She simply refused to keep shrinking herself for spaces that refused to see her worth. And in doing that, she didn't just translate words. She translated what power itself could look like. Her story shows us that the person most ignored in the room might be the one carrying the wisdom, the talent, and the courage to lead. So here's the truth: if you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever been underestimated, remember this. You don't need permission to rise. The moment you stop begging for a seat at the table and start building your own, everything changes. You change. And when you change, the world has no choice but to catch up. If this story stirred something in you, if you saw a piece of yourself in Grace, share it. Tell me, what's one room you're ready to stop apologizing for being in? And if you believe more stories like this need to be told, stories that lift unheard voices and challenge the rules, stick with us. Because this isn't the end. This is the beginning. And the next story, it just might be yours.